Which country holds the absolute most power and influence in the world today? Politics, economy, culture, arts, society, and science. A nation that stands at the very center, holding the rest of the globe in the palm of its hand. It is, of course, the United States of America. But has America always been this global titan? Believe it or not, this nation was born only about 250 years ago. How did it manage to rise to the top and become the most significant player on the world stage in such a short time? To understand the America we see today, we have to look at its history written in blood. The full, uncensored story of America's founding. We're uncovering it all right here on Flat Archive. Hello everyone. Starting today, I'm going to take you on a journey through the true story of how America was built. Now, I know this story has been told 1,000 times, but instead of just listing dates and facts, we're going to connect the scattered dots to reveal the massive flow of history in this deep dive series. July 4th, 1776. With the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the America we know today was born. So who exactly was America declaring independence from? You guessed it, Great Britain. The 13 colonies established by Britain on the North American continent fought a fierce war against their mother country. That victory marked the beginning of the United States. But we have to ask, why was the Revolutionary War inevitable? And what was the ultimate reason Britain established colonies in America in the first place? To find the answer, we need to turn back the clock all the way to 15th century Europe. By the late 15th century, European nations began looking across the ocean, dreaming of a new world. But why suddenly leave home? Well, there were a few key reasons. The Black Death had previously wiped out a third of Europe's population, but after about 150 years, the population bounced back and commerce was revived. Naturally, this completely reshaped the social structure. With more people came a higher demand for foreign goods. This created jobs for merchants, explorers, and adventurers. And out of necessity, navigation technology began to improve at a rapid pace. The trade with the East, spices, gold, these weren't just commodities, they were tickets to instant, unimaginable wealth. Here's the crazy part. If you sent out 3 ships and 2 sank, leaving only 1 to return alive, you would still make a killing. That's how high the profit margins were. Picture this. A dock worker moving crates of spice sneaks just 1 handful into his pocket. That 1 handful could buy him a house and change his life forever. That is the kind of insane money we're talking about. It's worth risking my life. That was the mindset, and so the race to reach East Asia began. At the center of this storm stood one man. A 16th century Spanish chronicler once described him like this: "His discovery is the greatest event since the creation of the world." We grew up knowing him as a hero, the embodiment of the spirit of exploration, who discovered a new world. But there's another side to this coin. Critics argue celebrating his discovery is no different than celebrating the crimes of a murderer. This controversial figure is none other than the Italian-born Christopher Columbus. Though born in Genoa, Columbus cut his teeth as a sailor in Portugal. He had a radical idea. Instead of sailing east, he would sail west, across the Atlantic to reach Asia. Why? Because the traditional route around Africa's Cape of Good Hope was essentially a suicide mission. Columbus took his pitch to the King of Portugal, asking for funding. The answer was a hard no. The first reason was simple math. When Columbus presented his report on the Earth's size, his calculations were, well, let's just say a bit off. He estimated the Earth to be about 1/3 smaller than it actually is. He calculated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan as roughly 2,760 miles. In reality, it was over 12,200 miles, more than 4 times his estimate. So, naturally, the royal court looked at his numbers and said, "We can't trust this. Your math is completely wrong." The second reason was his ego. He didn't just want ships and supplies to open a new trade route. He demanded the title of admiral, giving him full jurisdiction over the ocean, and, get this, the power of life and death. On top of that, he wanted a perpetual 10% cut of all profits from any new lands discovered. Portugal, not being the wealthiest nation at the time, basically said, "You're dreaming." So Columbus packed his bags for Spain. He approached the famous power couple, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, begging them to back his westward voyage. After much hesitation, Ferdinand and Isabella actually said yes. Why? Because Columbus knew exactly how to play them. He understood that these two monarchs saw themselves as the ultimate defenders of the Catholic faith. He promised that the profits from his voyage would fund the spread of Catholicism and even help retake Jerusalem from Islamic rule. But there was another, more practical reason: pure rivalry with Portugal. Even back then, Spain was much larger than Portugal. Yet Portugal was the one dominating the seas and the lucrative spice trade. Spain was terrified that this immense wealth would tip the balance of power, leaving them in the dust. They realized, we need to get in the game, even if we're late. That fear of missing out is ultimately why they accepted Columbus's proposal. But here's the kicker: Spain wasn't exactly swimming in cash either. Queen Isabella was so committed that she reportedly pawned her own jewelry just to fund Columbus's ships. 1492. The green light is given. Columbus immediately set sail into the Atlantic with 3 ships and a crew of 90 men. After 10 grueling weeks at sea, they finally spot land. Columbus was absolutely convinced he had stepped foot in Asia. Reality check, he had actually landed in the Bahamas. Later, he sailed to Cuba, but in his mind, he was certain he had reached China. Believing he was in the East Indies, he looked at the Native Americans and called them Indios, the Spanish word for people of India. Because of this one geographical blunder, they were stripped of their true names and labeled Indians for centuries. That label stuck, becoming the official term used throughout American history. Upon meeting the natives, Columbus wrote these chilling words in his journal: "They should be good servants, for they repeat what we say to them. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." In other words, because they were peaceful and lacked advanced weapons, he saw them as easy targets for conquest. It gets worse. In a report to the Spanish king, he counted the native women as 7 heads. He used the specific word for counting livestock, not people. To him, these human beings were no different than cattle. Throughout the expedition, Columbus was obsessed with one thing: monetization. He heard aloe was valuable, so he loaded up about 2,200 pounds of it. He scoured the ocean floor for pearls. Basically, he turned the New World upside down looking for anything he could sell. To prove his success to Queen Isabella, he returned to Spain with trophies, green parrots, and 7 kidnapped natives. But the cost was high. He lost 2 of his 3 ships and had to leave 39 of his crew members behind on the island because they couldn't fit on the last remaining boat. Regardless of the losses, Columbus returned to a hero's welcome, and just 1 year later, he was ready to set sail again.
The goal for the second voyage wasn't just exploration anymore. It was about building a full-blown settlement colony. The plan was simple: plant Spanish roots in the New World, seize the land, and dominate the native population. Columbus had a grand vision for himself. He wouldn't just be an admiral, he would be the viceroy, ruling over this new land like a king. Because the goal was total domination, this second voyage turned into a bloodbath of brutal massacres. September 25th, 1493, Columbus set sail with a massive armada, 17 ships and over 1,200 men. Since he was now hailed as a Spanish hero, the scale of this expedition was light years beyond the first one. On the way, near St. Croix, the fleet encountered natives in a canoe. Columbus's response? He ordered them all to be beheaded immediately. It gets even more gruesome. When one of the natives, holding his own guts from a stomach wound, tried to crawl away, the soldiers threw him overboard and shot him with arrows just to make sure he couldn't warn his tribe. The slaughter didn't end there. When Columbus returned to check on the 39 men he'd left behind, he found the fort destroyed and everyone dead. Consumed by rage and a desire for revenge, he began a campaign of ruthless killing against the natives. He then forced the natives into labor to build a new colonial city. He named it La Isabela, in honor of the Queen. But the location was terrible, and the settlement failed. So they moved on and founded a new city, Santo Domingo, the present-day capital of the Dominican Republic. This time, the settlement stuck. But as the Spanish settlements thrived, the lives of the Native Americans turned into a living hell. When the land didn't yield enough gold or spices, Columbus pivoted to a new business model: human trafficking. He rounded up about 550 natives and shipped them off to Spain as slaves. He was still obsessed with gold, though. When the natives couldn't find any, his frustration turned into sadistic violence. The Spanish demanded gold quotas that were impossible to meet because the gold simply wasn't there. The punishment for missing a quota? They would chop off the natives' hands. The despair was so deep that indigenous parents drowned their own children to save them from slavery. Mass suicides became common. By 1498, Columbus set out on his third voyage, but his reputation was tanking. He hadn't paid his debts, he hadn't brought back the gold, and rumors of his brutality were spreading. With funding drying up, he left with a much smaller crew, just 226 men and 8 ships. This time, he actually reached the South American mainland. It was only then that he realized this isn't Asia, it's a completely different continent. But the bottom line? Still no gold. He couldn't control the colonial rebellions, and the charges of abuse piled up. The man who wanted to be a king was eventually arrested, chained like a criminal, and shipped back to Spain in shackles. Even after Columbus's voyages, Spain didn't hit the brakes on exploration. Not even close. They had one single obsession driving them forward: gold. They went into a mining frenzy. Over the next 300 years, Spanish mines in the Americas extracted 10 times more gold and silver than all other mines in the world combined. And following in Columbus's footsteps came another man who would crush the continent under his boot: Hernán Cortés. Cortez set his sights on the Aztec Empire, a massive power that ruled over the Valley of Mexico. His strategy? He took the emperor hostage, seizing control of the empire without a major battle. But the moment Cortez left the city for a brief period, all hell broke loose. An unexpected bloodbath began. It was a traditional Aztec festival day. The locals were preparing for a celebration, but Cortez's men, paranoid and on edge, mistook the gathering for a rebellion plot. They opened fire, starting a massacre. In that chaos, 600 Aztec citizens were slaughtered. The Aztecs, fueled by rage, fought back with everything they had. When Cortez returned, the rebellion was so fierce that he was forced to flee for his life. It was a disaster for the Spanish. Over 1,000 soldiers and native allies were killed. Cortez himself even lost 2 fingers in the fighting. History remembers this night as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But Cortez wasn't done. He retreated, regrouped, and launched a counterattack to crush the Aztecs once and for all. He cut the city's aqueduct, choking off their water supply, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. Trapped, starving, and riddled with disease, the Aztecs somehow held out for 70 agonizing days. But bravery couldn't beat technology. They stood no chance against Cortez's arsenal of muskets, cannons, and steel. Now, on paper, the Aztecs had way more soldiers, but they had 2 fatal problems. First, the technology gap was massive. The Aztecs were fighting with wooden clubs embedded with obsidian shards and throwing stones. Against steel armor, it didn't matter how many men they had, their attacks were simply ineffective. And then came the Spanish secret weapon, the thing the Aztecs feared more than guns: giant dogs known as mastiffs. Cortez trained these war dogs to hunt humans, and true to their training, these beasts would tear through the native ranks, mauling and killing on command. In the end, about 100,000 Aztecs lay dead, with their population decimated and internal civil war breaking out. The great Aztec Empire finally fell to its knees. If you thought Cortez was bad, wait until you meet the man who might just surpass him in infamy, Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro heard about Cortez's success and thought, if he can do it, so can I. Driven by rumors of a golden kingdom hidden in South America, he rallied his own expedition team. In January 1531, he marched into the Inca Empire in present-day Peru. This wasn't some small tribe. It was a massive empire of gold, with a population of 9 million and a standing army of 70,000 soldiers. Pizarro sent a translator and a Catholic priest to confront the Inca leader, Atahualpa. They delivered a strict ultimatum: submit to the laws of Jesus Christ in the name of God and the King of Spain. Atahualpa asked to see the Bible. The priest handed it over, but it was closed. When the priest reached out to help him open it, Atahualpa, offended by the gesture, struck the priest's arm, as if to say, "How dare you?" The Bible fell to the ground. Seizing the moment, the priest screamed out to Pizarro, "Atahualpa has thrown the holy book to the earth!" That was the signal. Within less than 2 years, the mighty Inca Empire completely collapsed under the Spanish conquerors. By the late 16th century, Spain was unstoppable. They controlled the Caribbean, Mexico, and stretched all the way down through South America, covering modern-day Chile, Argentina, and Peru. And briefly, around 1580, when the Spanish and Portuguese crowns united, their grip even extended to Brazil. As Spain swept through Latin America and hoarded massive amounts of gold, their rivals across the ocean, Britain and France, started getting very nervous. We can't just sit here and watch. That sense of crisis, that was the spark.
It was the fuse that would eventually drive them to the North American continent. But still, it begs the question, even with inferior weapons, how did massive empires crumble so easily before just a handful of Europeans? Historians point to a few key factors. The biggest killer wasn't steel, it was biology. The Europeans brought diseases that the natives had zero immunity against. Influenza, measles, typhus. Millions were wiped out by these invisible enemies. There are records from the Mayan region of Mexico showing that within just a few years of contact, 95% of the native population had perished. And as the natives died in droves, the Europeans twisted this tragedy to fit their narrative. They claimed this mass death was proof of God's will, a divine sign that they were destined to rule over the new world. Now, some people might look at this history and ask, aren't cruelty and violence just the necessary engines of human progress? I fundamentally disagree. Yes, it is inevitable for humans to expand, connect, and build nations. We are not meant to live in isolation. However, we have to face the fact that for 99% of our history, that growth has been paved with violence, looting, and what we call a history of blood. Does that mean we justify it? Absolutely not. We strive to learn from it, to build a society based on dialogue and cooperation, not conquest. We look back at this bloody past not to celebrate it, but to find the will and the lessons to choose a different path forward. That is the true purpose of history.
The Age of Discovery. The great powers of Europe are setting sail across vast oceans, hunting for a new world. They landed believing they had found East Asia, but what they actually stepped onto was the American continent. Sure, it wasn't the mystic East they were looking for, but with its massive landmass and untold riches, America was the perfect place to build new colonies. And then, a new European powerhouse entered the ring. Enter Great Britain. Just like Spain, they crossed the ocean dreaming of a golden future, obsessed with the idea of settling down and getting their hands on all that treasure. But here's the big question. Could Britain actually pull it off? Could they successfully settle the land and build an empire? Spain had already conquered South America, amassing huge wealth from looted gold and silver. Naturally, seeing Spain's success made the other European nations pretty jealous. Even France got in on the action. In 1534, explorer Jacques Cartier discovered the Canadian region and established New France in North America. Watching all this, Britain was desperate for a slice of the pie, but they hit a snag. Where exactly should they build their colony? After some strategy sessions, they set their sights on North America, a place where Spain's grip wasn't yet strong. Here's a fun fact, though. On paper, Britain actually made contact with the New World only 5 years after Spain did. Back in 1497, an explorer named John Cabot explored the northeastern coast of North America, backed by King Henry VII. But Cabot failed to find the route to the east he was looking for. After that, nearly a century passed before Britain seriously tried to colonize this land again. Fast forward to the 16th century, London's industry was booming. Suddenly, there was a massive surge of people in London itching to settle in the New World. Britain spotted the fertile land along the east coast of North America and decided, this is it. This is where we build. December 20th, 1606, the London Company, chartered by King James I, finally launched their expedition and set sail from London bound for America. 144 people boarded 3 ships, the Godspeed, the Discovery, and the Susan Constant, heading straight for the unknown continent. It was a brutal journey. Only 104 of them survived to actually set foot on American soil. Britain's first colony was established on the East Coast, carefully positioned to stay out of the way of the Spanish and French territories. They named the land Virginia. This comes from the word virgin, honoring Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen of England, who never married. And right where their ships landed in Virginia, they established a settlement and called it Jamestown, named, of course, for King James I.
They picked an inland spot, thinking it would keep them safe from native attacks. Turns out that was a huge mistake. Jamestown was built on low, swampy ground, terrible for farming and surrounded by dense forests. Worse, it was right on the doorstep of powerful Native American tribes. Basically, it was a recipe for total disaster. Then came the diseases, like malaria. The settlers were absolutely decimated by sickness and starvation. By January 1608, when a supply ship finally arrived, only 38 of the original 104 settlers were still alive. But believe it or not, the real nightmare was just beginning. In 1609, the Virginia Company in London secured a new royal charter, granting them more power and land. They also sent Lord de la Warr to serve as the colony's first official governor. To get people to go, they tried 2 tactics, offering company stock to planters who paid their own way, and for the poor, paying their passage in exchange for 7 years of labor, what we call indentured servitude. Take a look at this pamphlet cover used to lure immigrants. It promised that life in Virginia would guarantee a rich harvest. Yeah, right. So about 600 people, including women and children, set sail for Virginia on 9 ships. It was a disaster. One ship vanished in a hurricane and another got wrecked off the coast of Bermuda, leaving them stranded for months. And even for those who actually made it to Jamestown, many of them died of fever before winter even hit. The winter of 1609 to 1610. Historians call it the starving time for a reason. The local tribes stripped the forest of all game and laid siege to the fort, effectively trapping the settlers inside their own walls. Cut off and desperate, they ate anything they could find. Dogs, cats, rats, snakes, even boiled shoe leather. It got so bad that survivors spoke of eating corpses. Archaeologists even found butchery marks on settler bones, chilling proof that they resorted to cannibalism. Back to spring, out of 240 settlers, only 60 of them were standing. Yet, despite the death and horror, the colony didn't just survive, it actually expanded. New settlements started popping up all along the river, stretching out from Jamestown. How? 2 reasons. First, the governor imposed strict military discipline. Second, they went on the offensive, aggressively pushing back native tribes to secure their land. But the third reason is the game changer. They discovered tobacco. Ever since Columbus brought tobacco back from the West Indies, Europe had been hooked. By the early 16th century, everyone was puffing away. Enter John Rolfe. In 1612, this Jamestown planter started experimenting with growing tobacco right there in Virginia. It was a massive hit. Soon, tobacco farms were spreading like wildfire up and down the James River. But here's the catch. Tobacco is a greedy crop. It sucks the nutrients right out of the soil. So to keep growing it, you constantly need fresh land. Driven by profit, English farmers kept pushing inland, encroaching deeper and deeper into Native American territory. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the locals. tensions with the native tribes were reaching a boiling point. March 1622, the tribes launched a coordinated surprise attack, entering settlements pretending to trade. In a single day, they wiped out 347 settlers, men, women, and children. The aftermath was brutal. The Virginia Company went belly up, and in 1624, King James I revoked their charter, taking direct control. Over 17 years, over 8,500 settlers had arrived, but a staggering 80% of them died. By most standards, Virginia looked like a total failure. So, is this it? Does Britain just pack up and give up on the American dream? September 1620, Plymouth, England. A ship carrying about 100 passengers and 30 crew members casts off, setting a course for the American continent. That ship was the legendary Mayflower. They weren't naive. They knew the horror stories from Virginia, the starvation, the plagues, the bloody conflicts with native tribes. They knew the odds were stacked against them. So why go? Why risk death? The answer lies in who was on that boat. There were investors, merchants, craftsmen, but most importantly, there were the Puritans, specifically a radical group known as separatists. But what drove these Puritans to flee England for the wilderness? These were reformers who believed the Church of England was corrupt and needed purifying, and they lived by an incredibly strict code. No getting drunk, no swearing, no entertainment, no flashy clothes or jewelry, and Sunday, that was for God alone. Absolutely no working and definitely no playing. It was a fundamentalist lifestyle, pure and simple. But then came Queen Elizabeth I in 1558. She solidified the Anglican Church as the only game in town. The Puritans hated it. To them, the Anglican Church looked too much like the Catholic Church they despised. Fancy decorations, ornate robes. The Puritans wanted simple, stripped-down worship. The Queen needed the Church to maintain her power, so these rebellious Puritans were a massive thorn in her side. She treated them like traitors. There's even a story of a Puritan who criticized her and had his right hand chopped off as punishment. When King James I took the throne, the Puritans hoped for a change. They petitioned him to scrub the Catholic remains from the church. But kings love the state church because it reinforces their power. James I shut them down immediately. Instead of changing the church, he told them, "You conform to us or else." And then, to add insult to injury, while Puritans believed Sunday was for quiet prayer, the king practically started a Sunday football league. He issued the Book of Sports, explicitly telling people, go ahead, drink beer, dance, and play sports on Sunday afternoons. It was a direct slap in the face to the Puritans. That was the final straw. They decided, we can't live here anymore. We're going to a new land to build our own nation, our own way. Crushed by religious persecution, the Puritans started looking for a place to build their dream religious state. Their eyes turned to a neighbor, the Netherlands. They chose it because it was close. They arrived with high hopes for a new life. But, well, the Dutch already had their own society running. It was crowded, and fitting in was tough. They ended up at the bottom of the ladder, treated as unskilled foreign labor, paid dirt-poor wages, and facing discrimination. But the real deal breaker, even though the Dutch were Protestants, they were, well, a little too liberal for the Puritans. They looked around and thought, how can we raise our kids here? If they hang out with these Dutch kids, they'll be morally corrupted. So they decided they needed to leave. That's when they looked to the English colonies in North America. In 1620, seeking a heaven on earth with true religious freedom, they boarded the Mayflower. The voyage was a living nightmare, just like for those before them.
Storms battered the ship, leaving them drifting. Food ran out, forcing them to survive on dried meat and rock-hard biscuits known as hardtack. Worst of all, scurvy started to spread. It was absolute hell on the water. It got so bad that some passengers nearly mutinied, begging to turn the ship around and go back to England. As time dragged on, tensions on the ship reached a breaking point. Arguments were breaking out, and it was obvious if they landed like this, it would be total chaos. They knew they needed rules before setting foot on land, so they drafted a document, a solemn agreement. This became known as the Mayflower Compact. 41 men gathered and pledged their loyalty to the king. They vowed to build a colony, form a civil body politic for their better ordering and preservation, and create just and equal laws that everyone would obey. They swore to uphold this contract for the general good of the colony. In other words, we decide our own fate and we take responsibility for it. This is where the spirit of self-governance was born. The fundamental American value that everyone is equal starts right here. Because of that phrase, to enact equal laws, the Mayflower Compact is celebrated as the first self-governing constitution in American history. Finally, the Mayflower reached Prounstown on November 11, 1920. A month later, on December 21st, they dropped anchor at their permanent home, Plymouth, Massachusetts. When they finally stepped onto the land, only 53 people were left. That was barely half of the group that had started the journey. They dreamed of a fresh start, but woke up to a nightmare. There were no other European settlers in Massachusetts. They were completely on their own. And finding food in the dead of a brutal winter, nearly impossible. Malnutrition and disease swept through the camp, claiming the lives of half the settlers. Just when all seemed lost, an unexpected helping hand appeared. It was the local Native American tribe, the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag chief didn't just tolerate them, he formed an alliance. They brought gifts of venison and turkey, furs for warmth, and taught the settlers how to plant corn, hunt wildlife, and build proper shelters. After their first successful harvest, the settlers threw a feast and invited their native allies to celebrate. That gathering, that's what we now know as Thanksgiving Day. But sadly, this peace didn't last. About 13 years later, smallpox arrived from Europe. It swept through the region, wiping out almost the entire native population near Plymouth. Despite the tragedy around them, the Plymouth colony itself managed to thrive, and waves of new immigrants kept arriving from England. In 1630, the floodgates opened. A massive fleet of 17 ships carrying 1,000 people set sail for New England. In the 17th century, this was the single largest migration of families the world had seen. They didn't waste time. Towns sprung up fast, anchored by a bustling new hub, Boston Harbor. From there, the settlers spread out. They weren't just in Massachusetts anymore. They were pouring into Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maryland. At first, the New England settlers and the natives kept the peace. They were friendly. But as time ticked by, a heavy tension started to build between them. Reason number one, land lust. As the settler population exploded, they started encroaching on native territory, hungry for more and more ground. You see, there was a fundamental clash of worldviews here, specifically how they viewed land. To the settlers, land was property. Survival depended on owning it. To the natives, land wasn't something you could own or sell. It was for everyone to use. The settlers saw the natives using only what they needed and thought, look at them, they're just letting all this land go to waste. They couldn't understand the native way, so they justified taking it by thinking, Well, they aren't using it properly, so it's free real estate. It's ours now. Reason number 2, religion. Remember, the Puritans came here to protect their faith, and part of that mission was a mandate to convert the natives. The nice ones tried to teach them English so they could read the Bible. But come on, did they really think that would work easily? The natives had their own identity and traditions. They asked, why should we give up who we are? When they refused to convert, the Puritan mindset shifted from let's save them to let's get rid of them. Puritan leaders started saying, these people are a threat to our holy community. We can't live with them anymore. And just like that, the helpful neighbors who saved them from starvation were rebranded as enemies, heathens, and savages. Reason number 3, this one gets complicated. Just like in South America, the native tribes weren't united. They were fractured and often at war with each other. The hostility between tribes was intense. Across this vast land, every tribe had different lifestyles and aggression levels. There was no sense of one nation among them. And the settlers, they were even more divided. Cities popped up before any real government could form. It was the Wild West out there. Orders from London were basically ignored. Later on, the British Crown tried to step in and play referee. They'd say, stop fighting the natives. Look, the river is the border. That's their land. This is yours. Just chill out. Why? Because wars cost money. Sending troops to save settlers was draining the British treasury. They basically pleaded, there's plenty of land. Just draw a line and stay on your side. But, of course, nobody listened. Inevitably, these deep divisions didn't just cause arguments, they ignited a bloodbath. 1636, the Connecticut Valley. Tensions finally exploded between English settlers and the local powerhouse, the Pequot tribe. The Pequots controlled the Connecticut region, but as the Massachusetts Puritans pushed south, aggressively encroaching on their land, the powder keg blew. War was on. Over a year of skirmishes, the Pequots killed about 13 Englishmen. When news spread, the Puritans and settlers were absolutely furious. Retribution was swift. They raised a militia of about 90 men. On the dawn of May 26, 1637, they launched a surprise raid on a Pequot village, and the slaughter began. It was a massacre. About 500 villagers died. Half of them burned alive in their own homes. In just 2 years, the Pequot tribe was effectively wiped off the map. To the victor go the spoils. The Puritans seized vast territories, taking control of almost all native lands in the Northeast. But the bloodshed wasn't over. In 1675, the deadliest and most brutal conflict of the century broke out, King Philip's War. The English called him King Philip, but his people knew him as Metacottum. He was the chief of the Wampanoag, yes, the very same tribe that had once saved the Pilgrims. Now he was leading a massive uprising against them. For 3 years, they ravaged Massachusetts, destroying towns and killing over 1,000 settlers. But in 1676, the tide turned when the British gained an unlikely ally, the Mohawk tribe. This was the classic British strategy, divide and conquer. They pitted tribe against tribe. From the native perspective, this internal division was their fatal flaw. The Mohawks ambushed Metacottum and shot him dead. With their leader gone, the native alliance crumbled, and the British finally crushed the rebellion. There's a specific reason why the casualty count in King Philip's War was so horrific. It all comes down to a leap in military technology. Meet the flintlock musket. Before this, settlers used old-school rifles that were heavy, clunky, and had terrible aim. Those old matchlocks were a nightmare. You needed a literal burning match and a stand just to fire one shot. But the new flintlocks, they were lighter, handheld, and could fire without all that hassle. A total game changer. Now, there was a strict ban on teaching natives how to use or repair these guns, but the tribes weren't waiting around. They realized the power of these weapons, bought them in bulk, and even taught themselves how to fix them. The result? With both sides armed to the teeth with modern tech, the death toll skyrocketed unlike anything seen before. Driven by this firepower, settlers seized more land. The human cost was devastating. In 1660, there were about 121,000 natives in the Northeast. Just 10 years later, less than half remained. But here's a strange pause in our story. After 1632, for nearly 30 years, silence. Britain didn't establish a single new colony. Why? Because back home, England was falling apart. What kind of crisis could stop a superpower for 30 decades? And how did they bounce back to finally build the legendary 13 colonies? It all started when King Charles I dissolved Parliament and began ruling as an absolute monarch. Naturally, this caused him to rapidly lose the trust of his people. By 1640, Charles was broke. He reconvened Parliament just to demand new taxes, but after dissolving them twice in 2 years, Parliament had enough. Tensions exploded, and by 1642, Parliament actually organized its own army to fight back. This marked the beginning of the English Civil War, also known as the Puritan Revolution. The war ended with the shocking execution of Charles I. In his place, Oliver Cromwell, who led the opposition, took control as Lord Protector. Consequently, during this domestic chaos, Britain's colonial expansion in America had to take a back seat. But here's the twist. After Cromwell passed, his son took over and proved to be, well, pretty incompetent. This paved the way for the executed king's son, Charles II, to return and reclaim the throne. With the monarchy restored, Puritans faced persecution once again, sparking a massive wave of migration to the Americas. From the Carolinas, New York, and New Jersey, all the way to Georgia. This is how the famous 13 colonies were established. So, the big question is, why did these 13 colonies eventually rise up and fight a war of independence against Britain? Let's break it all down.
With the restoration of the monarchy, a massive wave of British immigrants flooded into the East Coast, centered around Massachusetts. This is when the colonies really started to establish themselves permanently. From Virginia, the very first settlement, to Massachusetts, where the Puritans landed on the Mayflower, all the way down to Georgia in 1732, Britain established what we know today as the 13 colonies. And here's the interesting part. These colonies weren't all the same. They developed into 3 very distinct societies. First up, New England, centered around Massachusetts. Because of the cold weather and rocky soil, farming was tough there. Instead, they took advantage of the abundant timber and the coastline to build a booming fishing and shipbuilding industry. Also, since it was settled by Puritans, the society there was quite religiously conservative. Next, we have the Middle Colonies, anchored by New York and Pennsylvania. They were known as the breadbasket because they exported tons of wheat. Unlike the North, this region was religiously tolerant and diverse, becoming a melting pot of Quakers, Lutherans, and Catholics. Finally, the Southern colonies, led by Virginia and the Carolinas. Thanks to the fertile soil, they could grow massive cash crops on plantations. Many people came here strictly for economic reasons. The upper class, mostly Anglicans, were very proud of their British heritage and maintained strong ties to the motherland. Surprisingly, Britain kept a pretty loose leash on the colonies during this time.
Sure, each colony had a king-appointed governor, but often even locals took on that role rather than someone sent from London. The settlers got used to running things themselves. They held elections to pick their officials and set up town councils to handle daily issues like policing, farming, and education. Over time, these elected assemblies became more powerful than the governors. This taste of self-rule was crucial. It laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the fight for independence. While this was happening, Spain and France were busy expanding their territories, and the Dutch joined the game too. Around 1620, seeking to cash in on the fur trade, they set up a trading post along the Hudson River and named it after their capital, New Amsterdam. As they expanded, there was one specific spot the Dutch merchants were desperate to get their hands on. After some bargaining, they bought it from the Native Americans for some trinkets and beads. That piece of land is what we now call Manhattan Island. Now get this, those beads and trinkets were worth about $24. Think about the insane real estate prices in Manhattan today per square foot. The Dutch bought the entire island for $24. Today, you couldn't even get a hostel bed near Central Park for that kind of money. But the Dutch didn't keep it for long. The British swooped in, seized control by force, and took over New Amsterdam. To honor the Duke of York, who supported the war, they renamed the city New York. While Britain was settling the 13 colonies, other European superpowers weren't just sitting around. With Britain, France, and Spain all crowding into eastern North America, turf wars over land were basically inevitable. Tensions really boiled over in the Ohio River Valley, leading to a full-blown war in 1756. Originally, this was French territory, where settlers lived peacefully alongside Native Americans. Britain, essentially, was the aggressor, trying to muscle in and take over. So when the fighting started, who did the Native Americans side with? France. They trusted the French, who treated them more like partners than enemies. This created a matchup of Britain versus France and their Native American allies. This 7-year conflict is what we call the French and Indian War. After 7 brutal years, Britain emerged victorious. As the winner, Britain seized vast territories in the Midwest from France, effectively taking control of almost all of eastern North America. But here is where the butterfly effect kicks in. This victory actually sowed the seeds for the American Revolution. War is expensive. After 7 years of fighting, Britain was drowning in debt. Raising taxes on citizens back in London was politically too risky, so the government decided, hey, let's just send the bill to the American colonies instead. Britain thought the colonies would be grateful for their protection. They expected a stronger bond. Instead, they accidentally triggered a massive tax war. Britain started slapping tariffs on imported goods like sugar, coffee, and wine. They specifically targeted sugar, which was in high demand, passing the infamous Sugar Act. Now, this wasn't just about having sweet coffee in the morning. The real problem, it crippled the production of rum and other spirits, which relied heavily on sugar. That was a huge blow to the local economy. But here's the thing. The sugar tax barely made a dent in Britain's massive debt, nor did it cover the cost of keeping troops in America. So the government got greedy. In 1765, they rolled out the Stamp Act. This act was ridiculous. It required virtually every piece of paper used in the colonies, newspapers, pamphlets, posters, legal contracts, even college diplomas, to carry a purchased British revenue stamp. They even taxed playing cards. Can you believe that? But the craziest one was the tax on lawyers' licenses. In today's money, that stamp alone would cost over $3,000. No wonder the lawyers were mad. The colonists were furious. Britain was taxing them without their consent. They finally drew a line in the sand and started protesting, refusing to pay the tax. This movement wasn't just for the elites. It brought everyone together: farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, and the working class.
Their participation was a game changer. It was the first real step toward political unity and, eventually, independence. And the best part? It actually worked. The backlash was so intense that the British government eventually caved in and repealed the Stamp Act. But Britain just wouldn't let it go. They needed that money, so they cooked up a new plan, the Townshend Acts. This time they slapped import tariffs on everyday essentials coming from Britain: paper, glass, tea, lead, and paint. Taxing daily necessities, that was the last straw. The colonists were livid. Their argument was simple: we don't have anyone representing us in the British Parliament. Passing laws without our consent is illegal. They felt their fundamental rights as British subjects were being stripped away. Anti-British sentiment was reaching a boiling point, and from this anger, one of the most famous slogans in history was born: no taxation without representation. Interestingly, while similar ideas fueled the French Revolution later, America said it first. Once this slogan hit the London Magazine in 1768, it became the rallying cry for the colonies, lighting the spark that would eventually lead to the Revolutionary War. In response to the Townshend Acts, the colonies hit back where it hurt. They boycotted British goods. The backlash was so fierce that Britain, fearing widespread riots, repealed the taxes on everything, except for one thing: tea. But then trouble brewed from an unexpected place. The British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. To bail them out, the British government passed the Tea Act. Now, this wasn't really about raising taxes. It was about allowing the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a bargain price. While that sounds good for drinkers, it was a disaster for local merchants. They couldn't compete with those undercut prices and faced total bankruptcy. The merchants were furious, sparking another massive boycott. In most ports, colonists refused to let the tea ships even dock. But in Boston, the British governor insisted on forcing the ships to unload their cargo. And that standoff led to the legendary event of 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Hearing that the tea would be unloaded by force, a group of colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians to hide their identities. They boarded the ships and dumped every single crate of tea into the harbor. They destroyed about 9,700 pounds sterling worth of tea. That's roughly $1.7 million in today's money. By the way, if you visit Boston today, there's a replica ship where you can actually reenact this. You can throw the crates into the water yourself. Don't worry, they're attached to ropes so you can pull them back up. The British government was absolutely livid at the colonists' defiance. To punish them, they played their hardest card yet. They passed the Coercive Acts, or, as the Americans famously call them, the Intolerable Acts. Here's what they demanded. 1. The port of Boston would be completely closed until the colonists paid for every ounce of the ruined tea. 2. The king took direct control, appointing the governor's council and sheriffs, effectively stripping their self-governance. 3. Any British official or soldier accused of a crime would be tried back in England, not in the colonies. And 4. The Quartering Act, which forced colonists to provide housing for British troops if needed. The strategy was simple: isolate Boston from the other colonies and crush their spirit with legal sanctions. But here's where it all backfired. Instead of isolating Boston, these harsh measures enraged everyone. It completely blew up in Britain's face. The other colonies realized if we don't fight now, we're next. They saw this as a direct threat to their liberty. The sentiment was clear: we built this life in a new world, and now British aristocrats and the king want to treat us like subjects without rights. To respond to this threat, history was made in September 1774. 55 delegates from the colonies gathered to form the First Continental Congress. The
the room was filled with heavy hitters: George Washington, who would become the first president; John Adams, the future second president; and Samuel Adams. This was the first time a unified body truly represented the voice of the American colonies. They took a stand. They adopted a declaration denying Parliament's right to interfere in their internal affairs and sent a petition to the king demanding the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. But Britain doubled down. They declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion, banned trade with other nations, and even stripped away their fishing rights in the North Atlantic, their main source of income. Pushed to the brink, there was no turning back. The stage was set. The War of Independence had begun.
Strictly speaking, the Revolutionary War was a conflict fought within the 13 British colonies on the East Coast. But remember, the map was crowded. France and Spain held massive territories surrounding them, and the Native American nations in the interior were a powerful force to be reckoned with. This complex geopolitical puzzle created a lot of chaos for British policymakers. But here's the massive dilemma Britain faced. They had no viable way to actually rule America. A war needs a clear, achievable goal. You can fix bad tactics or a messy operation, but if the fundamental purpose of your war is flawed, there is no fixing that. The coercive laws they tried to enforce weren't just a question of right or wrong, they were physically impossible to enforce. Sending an army to uphold unenforceable laws made the war unwinnable from the very start. Now, textbooks usually tell us the rebellion was all about taxes, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and British oppression, but there is a much deeper, more fundamental root cause. Think about it. If a British person moved to India or Egypt back then, they didn't say, "I'm going to become Indian or Egyptian." No, they wanted to stay British, to keep that royal protection. But America? Completely different story. The settlers here stopped being British subjects and started becoming Americans. Remember, this wasn't British society moving overseas. These were the outcasts, the people who were persecuted in or hated Britain. Plus, there was the religion gap. Britain was Anglican. If you weren't Anglican, you weren't considered a real citizen. This naturally created a psychological split. You aren't one of us. So any loyalty Americans felt toward Britain was mostly just nostalgia, a fading memory. And we all know that kind of sentimental loyalty snaps the moment money or politics get in the way. They had built their own society, their own systems. They were already living in a different world. Also, here's a crucial realization. During the French and Indian War, the colonists noticed something. The mighty British army wasn't invincible in the American wilderness. European tactics didn't work in these forests. Seeing that weakness gave them the guts to fight back. Finally, the demographics were the nail in the coffin. It wasn't just English people. You had Scots, Irish, people who had no love for London. When they arrived, the British often pushed them to the dangerous frontier as a buffer against Native Americans, not exactly a way to win their loyalty. Then came the non-English speakers, Germans, Dutch, you name it. With German towns, Dutch towns, and Irish towns, calling the 13 colonies British became just a technicality. With such a melting pot of cultures, the emotional bond to the motherland was basically non-existent. We all know Patrick Henry's legendary cry in Virginia, "Give me liberty or give me death." It's the symbol of the revolution. But historians still debate if he actually said it exactly like that. The real argument that moved people wasn't just abstract heroism, it was pragmatic. Taxation violates our liberty. It wasn't just about dying for freedom, it was about fighting to protect their property, their happiness, and their communities. That is the true, practical essence of the Declaration of Independence. The British Empire, determined to crush the colonists, and the American colonists refusing to back down and standing tall against the motherland. The rift between them grew deeper by the day, spiraling to a point of absolutely no return. With the colonists' declaration of war, the Revolutionary War finally erupted, marking the true beginning of American history. But here's the real question. How could a ragtag group of colonists with no real army possibly hope to defeat Britain, commanding the world's most powerful navy? Thus began the clash between an empire crossing an ocean to suppress its subjects and 13 colonies desperate for their independence. A war that soaked the continent in blood. Who would emerge victorious? Let's dive in and find out right now. In October 1774, the colonists started getting serious about war preparations. They convened the Massachusetts Provincial Congress in the town of Concord. But why choose Concord? It was strategic, close enough to Boston to monitor the situation, yet secluded enough to hide their activities from the British. The radicals who led the Boston Tea Party made a bold resolution at this Congress. To defend their lives, property, and liberty, they declared, "We must arm ourselves." For months, farmers and locals stockpiled weapons and ammo. They formed a specialized militia known as the Minutemen, forces ready to deploy at a literal minute's notice. Now, I know we tend to romanticize the idea of a militia and view it as something heroic. But in the context of Western military history, calling a group a militia isn't exactly high praise. Just slapping a helmet on someone and lining them up in a uniform doesn't make them a soldier. To be brutally honest, it basically translates to, that is not a real professional army. At the time, the American side managed to muster up about 18,000 of these militia members. At the time, Boston was occupied by the British regulars, better known as the Redcoats. We're talking about the single most well-oiled military machine in Europe. Their officers were battle-hardened veterans of the 7 Years' War, and as aristocrats, they carried themselves with immense pride and confidence. However, the British commander, General Thomas Gage, wasn't so sure. He calculated that his forces were stretched too thin and decided he couldn't make a move without reinforcements. But then intelligence came in. He received a tip that the militia was stockpiling a massive amount of ammunition in Concord. Gage realized if they organize an army and gather weapons, we are in deep trouble. Driven by this fear, he decided to launch a preemptive strike. And this decision sparked the battles of Lexington and Concord, the opening shots that signaled the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. On the night of April 18, 1775, General Gage dispatched a detachment of about 1,000 troops to Lexington. Now, at this point, Gage wasn't looking for a bloodbath. His plan was simply to shock the colonists and seize their illegal weapons without firing a shot. But why was he so obsessed with taking their guns? In the early days of colonization, Britain actually encouraged settlers to own guns. They needed them to survive against Native American attacks and wild animals. So, from the very moment they set foot on American soil, they were armed. It is often said that American history is the history of the gun. From the very beginning, firearms were deeply woven into the fabric of this society. But everything changed after the Boston Tea Party. As tensions skyrocketed, Britain did a complete 180. They realized, wait, armed colonists are a threat, and immediately banned the export of firearms and ammunition to America. That led to the move on Concord. The British stance was clear. Possessing these weapons is illegal. We are confiscating them now. To the colonists, this wasn't just about losing property.
They saw it as a violation of their fundamental right to bear arms. Naturally, they fought back hard. This created a lasting belief. The only thing that stood between them and British tyranny was their guns. Even today, for many Americans, firearms represent the ultimate tool for self-preservation. Fast forward a bit, and this mindset solidified after independence. People feared that their new federal government might turn into another tyrant, just like Britain, and try to disarm them again. They decided they needed guns to check government power and defend their liberty. This led directly to the creation of the famous Second Amendment in the Constitution, enshrining the right to own weapons. It reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." This cemented gun ownership as a fundamental right in the American psyche, and it is this very sentence that fuels the heated gun control debates we still see in the US today.
But there is a fascinating piece of history we need to unpack here. Why were the colonists so terrified, so paranoid about the British taking their weapons? It wasn't just about defending themselves against wild animals or robbers. It was because they had a vivid, horrifying memory of something that happened just 30 years prior, back across the ocean on British soil. I'm talking about the disarming of the Scottish Highlands. In 1746, right after crushing a Scottish rebellion, the British government passed the infamous Disarming Act. British troops ransacked every village, seizing muskets and swords. They even banned the wearing of kilts, the very symbol of Scottish pride. Stripped of their weapons, the Scots couldn't defend their culture or their freedom. They were completely subjugated. Now, here's the twist. A huge number of people living in the colonies were Scottish immigrants who had lived through that nightmare. So when they heard the British were coming to empty the armory in Concord, it meant only one thing. They are doing it again. They're doing exactly what they did in Scotland. If we lose our guns, we become slaves. So the shots fired at Lexington weren't just an accident. It was an explosion of trauma and resolve. A declaration that they would never be disarmed victims again. This context really helps explain why Americans are so attached to the Second Amendment. Of course, it wasn't just about politics or history. There was a very real, practical reason too. Back in the day, everyone carried weapons for survival. But in places like Europe, as modern nations developed and police forces grew, a deal was made. The state will protect you now, so hand over your weapons. That's the standard path most European nations followed. But America, this land is just too vast. The police can't be everywhere. If you call for help, it might take 30 minutes or even more for them to arrive. So the mindset became, to protect my family and my home, I need a gun in my hand right now. Plus, since everyone else has a gun, including the bad guys, the logic sticks. You need to be armed to stand a fighting chance. So you have the historical fear of government tyranny on one side and the geographical reality of a vast frontier on the other. It's this perfect storm that keeps the gun control debate in America burning to this day. All right, let's rewind a bit and get back to the action at Lexington and Concord. The militia wasn't sleeping. They had their eyes glued to the British movements. As soon as the Redcoats mobilized, riders like the famous Paul Revere jumped on their horses. They galloped through the countryside, warning every village and farm that the regulars are coming. By the time the British arrived in Lexington the next morning, a few dozen militia members were already waiting for them at the Lexington Green. When the two sides met, the British took one look at this ragtag group of farmers and practically laughed. They sneered at them, expecting to just march right past without a fight. It looked like it might end in a stare-down until, bang, a shot rang out from nowhere and a militiaman hit the ground.
That single bullet is what history remembers as the shot heard round the world. But here's the mystery. To this day, nobody honestly knows who pulled the trigger first. According to a militia member, the British Major Pitcairn rode up and screamed, "Disperse, ye rebels, disperse!" When the colonists stood their ground, they claim Pitcairn gave the order to fire. On the flip side, the British officers and soldiers swore up and down, "No, the militia fired at us first." We may never know the truth, but the result was instant chaos. A firefight erupted, leaving 8 militiamen dead and 10 wounded in the blink of an eye. The British didn't stop to apologize. They pressed their advantage and marched straight to Concord, where the real battle was about to begin.
Here we see a clash of not just soldiers, but two completely different worlds of warfare. The British stuck to fighting in line formation. Imagine soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, marching forward in a tight, dense formation, while cannons blast the enemy lines from the rear. Once they got within killing range, about 75 to 100 yards, they would stop, face the enemy, and unleash a synchronized volley of fire. Then, while the enemy was scrambling to reload, they would charge in with bayonets to finish the job. For a commander, it was a game of nerves. How many volleys do we fire? When do we charge? The key to victory wasn't hiding, it was discipline, keeping that formation tight and unbroken no matter what. The militia, they threw that rulebook out the window. They used guerrilla tactics. They hid behind barns, trees, rocks, and stone walls, sniping at the British from complete cover. The British, who were marching in their polite, open lines, didn't know what hit them. They were basically sitting ducks fighting against shadows, and they struggled big time. To make matters worse for the Redcoats, the militia had already scrubbed the place clean. They'd moved most of the ammo to a safe location hours ago. The British started a war to seize weapons that weren't even there. The entire mission had lost its purpose. With nothing left to take, the British commanders made the call. We are retreating back to Boston. But the walk back, that was a nightmare. It wasn't just a march, it was a gauntlet. Militia members were ambushing them from every tree, fence, and shadow along the road. By the time they finally limped back to Boston, the damage was severe. The British suffered 73 deaths and 174 injuries. Compare that to the militia, who lost 49 men and had 39 wounded. The British took nearly 3 times the casualties of the rebels. It was a total disaster. The British Army didn't just fail the mission, they were humiliated. They had tasted the bitter pill of defeat. The British Army, the so-called invincible force, was brought to its knees, completely humiliated by the militia's chaotic guerrilla tactics. But make no mistake, what you saw today was just the appetizer. The stage is now set for Boston. We are moving from skirmishes to full-scale bloody warfare, where armies clash head-on. And stepping into the eye of this storm is the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. After the victory at Lexington and Concord, colonial morale was absolutely through the roof. The fire for independence was burning hotter than ever. But then reality set in. They realized the British aren't just going to walk away. They're coming back. This is it. We are officially at war. So just 3 weeks later, in May 1775, the colonial representatives gathered for the Second Continental Congress to gear up for the fight. Delegates from every colony, except Georgia at the time, came together, and they reached a consensus. It was time to fully back the war effort. Now, the game-changing decision here was to move beyond just local militias. They needed a proper, organized, regular force, which they formally dubbed the Continental Army, and naturally, they needed a commander-in-chief to lead it. That is exactly when they appointed their leader, a man who would go on to become the very first president of the United States, George Washington. Right after Washington took the helm as commander-in-chief, things escalated quickly. We're talking about the first major all-out conflict of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now picture Boston, where the British were entrenched. Directly north, there's a teardrop-shaped piece of land that looks almost like a mirror image of Boston itself. That is the Charlestown Peninsula. The Continental Army made a bold move and seized that northern peninsula by surprise. Why? Because they knew if they could set up cannons there, they could rain fire down on any British ships trying to enter or leave Boston Harbor. The British were completely caught off guard. Realizing the danger, they scrambled to launch a counterattack on Charlestown before it was too late. On the night of June 16th, under the cover of darkness, about 1,300 Continental soldiers crept onto the peninsula. They immediately started digging in on the tallest peak, Bunker Hill, and the lower Breeds Hill nearby. They worked furiously through the night, right under the British Army's nose. By the time the sun came up, they had miraculously built a redoubt, a defensive dirt wall standing over 6 feet tall. As the sun rose, the British fleet spotted the Americans and immediately opened fire with their cannons. Meanwhile, the British commanders in Boston scrambled to come up with a plan. But here was the problem. They had 4 generals, but no single supreme leader calling the shots. So naturally, they started a gentleman's debate. This was actually a chronic issue for the British military, all the way up to World War II. When things got urgent, they'd often sit around and talk in circles while the clock ticked. So there they were, spreading out their maps and arguing. Even the famous German General Rommel later mocked how ridiculous this situation was. Anyway, here's how their brainstorming session went down. Option 1, since the peninsula is shaped like a teardrop, they considered landing at the narrow strip connecting it to the mainland, known as the Neck, to trap the Americans inside. But it was risky. There was another American force stationed further north. The British realized, wait, are we trapping them or are we getting ourselves sandwiched between 2 enemy armies? It was a classic high-risk, high-reward scenario. Option 2 looked pretty slick on paper. Land on the southeast tip and cut right through the gap between Breeds Hill and Bunker Hill. It would have been a smart tactical move, but there was a deal breaker. The tides were all wrong. Waiting for the water to rise would have taken way too long. Finally, option 3, just land at the Charlestown Wharf, march through the town, and storm up the hill. This meant street fighting, urban warfare. But back then, armies weren't as terrified of it as they are today. So they looked at it and thought, this seems like the standard safe bet. While the British commanders were sitting around asking, so what's the move here? They were wasting precious time. In that window of hesitation, the Continental Army sealed off the Neck, that critical gap the British had been eyeing, and even brought in reinforcements. Basically, the British debated themselves into a corner. They missed out on all the smart tactical options and were left with only the most reckless path forward. In military terms, this is the textbook definition of losing the initiative. The British were essentially flying blind. They didn't understand the local terrain and their chain of command was a mess. General William Howe led the assault force of about 2,200 men and 10 cannons. But once they hit the ground, they realized the American defenses were solid. There were no weak spots to exploit. So Howe made a fateful decision, a direct head-on assault right up the face of Breeds Hill. Howe lined up his main force in a broad formation along the beach below the fortifications. But over on the east side, the terrain was tricky. There were steep coastal cliffs. The space was so tight that he had no choice but to funnel his soldiers into a long, narrow column just to push them forward. As the battle raged on,
thousands of Bostonians clambered onto rooftops, church steeples, basically any high point they could find just to watch the show. Believe it or not, there were actually more spectators than soldiers fighting. Because tens of thousands of people witnessed and wrote about it, this is one of the most well-documented battles in history. The British tried to execute these complex tactical maneuvers to dodge American fire, but without knowing the terrain and rushing the attack, it was doomed to fail. Now, the Continental troops weren't professional soldiers, but they were hardened by hunting and experience in the French and Indian War. These guys were sharpshooters. Hiding behind a wall and picking off targets, that was exactly their specialty. Here is a piece of history trivia. Even though we call it the Battle of Bunker Hill, the real fighting actually happened on Breed's Hill. When the British marched up in their standard formation, they were absolutely decimated by American volley fire. The British officers bravely rallied their shocked troops and pushed for a second assault, only to be cut down all over again.
That is when General Howe finally got his act together and switched up his strategy. He reorganized his troops into columns to punch through the line. At that exact moment, the Americans hit a crisis point. They ran out of ammunition. The British charge smashed through, tearing 2 holes in the defense, and suddenly redcoats were pouring over the walls like a flood. The Continental Army had no choice but to retreat. But amidst the chaos, a hero emerged. General Joseph Warren, the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, stayed behind. He chose to lead a final stand to cover his retreating men, fighting bravely until he made the ultimate sacrifice. So, technically, the British won the Battle of Bunker Hill. But was it really a win? Historians call this a Pyrrhic victory, a win that comes at a devastating cost. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties, while the Americans lost less than half that number. It proved that while the militia couldn't match the British in an open field, they were incredibly dangerous when fighting from a fortified position. Sure, the militia wasn't perfect, discipline was loose, and some men did run away, but they didn't collapse. They held the line, and even their retreat was orderly. General Howe wanted to teach the rebels a lesson about the superiority of the British Army. Instead, he got schooled. The battle became a massive morale booster, proving to the colonies that they could fight back. And that realization brought a flood of new recruits into the Revolution. You have to remember, this was before the French Revolution. The European aristocracy didn't believe in the power of the common man. British officers were used to commanding conscripts who were forced into service. They had to rule with an iron fist just to keep them in line or bribe them into fighting. Even then, desertion and disobedience were rampant. Sure, you can force a soldier to march and shoot, but you can't force voluntary bravery. To the British elite, the idea that these ragtag militias were fighting out of their own free will and passion, it was a concept they literally couldn't wrap their heads around. Even though there were local governors and officials, the British High Command didn't trust them because they were colonials. This meant the generals had to do everything themselves. Intelligence, politics, geography, strategy. It was a massive information overload that went way beyond their job description. Generals Gage and Howe felt completely isolated. They arrived in a land where everyone hated them, and they were basically under siege. And while the Royal Navy was powerful, the Atlantic Ocean is a beast. Knowing that every single bullet, every ration, and every soldier had to survive a dangerous ocean crossing made them incredibly nervous about their supply lines. The bloodbath at Bunker Hill poured gasoline on that anxiety. They realized they couldn't afford to take risks anymore. The goal shifted from crushing the rebellion to avoiding losses at all costs. This fear paralyzed the British command. For the rest of the war, this play-it-safe mentality led to hesitation, passivity, and ultimately a failure to make bold strategic moves when it mattered most.
Now, while the British failed to crush the rebellion at Bunker Hill, that didn't guarantee an American victory by a long shot. Enter George Washington, the commander-in-chief. He did have experience fighting as a militia officer in the French and Indian War, but let's be honest, he wasn't exactly known as a legendary war hero with a glittering resume at this point. Everyone agrees that Washington's superpower wasn't necessarily his tactical genius, but his character. While many British aristocrats were gentlemen in name only, Washington was the real deal, patient, polite, and deeply considerate. Because of this, some military historians still criticize his skills as a general. If you compare him to aggressive leaders like Napoleon or General Patton, Washington might come across as a bit of a desk general or just a really nice guy in a uniform. But that is a totally unfair take. You have to understand what he was working with. The Continental Army had plenty of spirit of liberty, but as an organization, it was a disaster. Congress had signed soldiers to one-year contracts, so guys would sign up out of patriotism, but once the reality set in, most of them were just counting down the days until they could go home. Uniforms and weapons, completely random. They couldn't even march in a straight line. When Washington inspected the camps, he was horrified. There were no latrines, no designated trash areas. The barracks were basically one giant garbage dump. And here is the kicker. These Americans loved liberty and equality so much that they didn't understand the concept of military discipline. They thought, hey, officers and privates are equal, right? So they'd just ignore orders. It wasn't an army, it was a social club where officers and soldiers hung out together. The officers didn't even know how to lead. And get this, when guards got bored on duty, they would actually walk over to the British lines, trade tobacco, and just chat with the enemy. Washington had the monumental task of turning this disorganized mob into a real fighting force. He started by teaching these free-spirited officers what their actual jobs were. He cracked down hard on laziness and insubordination, using strict discipline, fines, public shaming, you name it. Cowardice in battle, that was punished even more severely. Now, by modern standards, his methods might seem harsh, but compared to the brutal discipline in European armies at the time, he was actually quite reasonable. Because nobody from the officers to the privates knew what they were doing, Washington had to wear every hat, from a drill sergeant to the commander-in-chief. He micromanaged everything: how to march, how to set up camp, even how to cook dinner. Usually, people this obsessed with details miss the big picture, but not Washington. He was surprisingly good at predicting enemy moves and planning battles that actually fit his army's capabilities. He possessed a unique mix of kindness and terrifying persistence. So, what was his greatest strength in leading this ragtag group? It was his self-restraint. He knew exactly how to distinguish between what he wanted to do, what he had to do, and what he could do. But his true superpower as a leader was his eye for talent. While he was patient with the incompetent, he never hesitated to find hidden gems among the ranks and promote them to positions of power. But here's the hard truth. You can't transform a massive organization overnight, not even if you're George Washington. The gap between a militia and a professional army was just too wide. In the battles following Bunker Hill, the Continental Army usually got crushed, barely managed to draw, or only survived because the British generals were too timid to finish them off. In today's episode, we explored the hidden truths behind the Battle of Bunker Hill and Washington's desperate struggle to turn a ragtag mob into a disciplined force. The British won the battle, but lost their nerve. The Americans lost the hill, but found their potential. Now, let's be real. We all know how this story eventually ends, but the real question is, how? How does a chaotic militia actually defeat the British Empire? How did this mess of an army evolve to stand toe-to-toe with the deadliest military machine in the world? That transformation is the most thrilling and the most complex part of revolutionary history. On paper, this war looked like an easy win for the British. But against all odds, the Redcoats found themselves struggling against the ragtag,
Continental Army. They deployed their absolute best commanders to the front lines. Yet, on American soil, the British suffered massive casualties, pushing them to the very brink of disaster. The mighty British Army stuck in a nightmare against an amateur force. And then something shocking happened, almost as if to mock the empire. It was a historic turning point that finally glued the 13 colonies together into one united force. So, is this it? Is the British Army about to crumble without even putting up a real fight? But as the Congress met, there was a massive elephant in the room. The delegates couldn't actually agree on why they were fighting this war in the first place. Basically, the room was split down the middle. One side asked, "Do we want total independence?" While the other asked, "Or do we just want our rights back and stay loyal to the crown?" You had the heavy hitters like John and Samuel Adams, along with Virginia's Richard Henry Lee, pushing hard to break away. On the flip side, John Dickinson from Pennsylvania was practically begging for reconciliation with Britain. Here's the thing. At first, most colonists weren't actually looking to start a new country. They just wanted to fix their grievances within the British Empire. Remember, Britain was the global superpower back then. Going it alone was a terrifying idea. Without the protection of the Royal Navy, the strongest in the world, how would they possibly survive Atlantic trade? And it wasn't just the ocean. They had French and Spanish colonies breathing down their necks right there in the Americas. Could they really fend off France, Spain, and Native American tribes without British backup? That's exactly why so many folks opposed independence. They wanted to cut a deal, secure some self-rule, and stay safe under the British umbrella. But just 1 year into the war, public opinion took a massive U-turn. Britain started recruiting Native Americans, enslaved people, and even German mercenaries to fight us. That enraged the colonists, and when the Crown blockaded our ports and flat out refused to talk, that's when people realized independence is the only option left. But the people still needed a push. Enter the game changer, a thinker who had just arrived from England named Thomas Paine. He'd been in America for less than 2 years, but in January 1776, he dropped a pamphlet called Common Sense, and this one little book completely flipped the script for everyone who still wanted to stay loyal to Britain. He didn't hold back. He argued, for centuries they've lied to us that the king can do no wrong. He pointed out that whenever the government oppressed the people, the king's advisors took the blame, while the king himself remained untouchable, a symbol of justice. That is absolute nonsense, Paine declared. He argued that kings rule by force, not right. He even called George III a royal brute who simply demands submission to satisfy his own cruelty. He went on to say, "I've seen America, and it is the last refuge of mankind." He believed this land was the only hope for realizing true freedom and equality. He invoked the idea of a city upon a hill, a special nation that the whole world would look up to. His conclusion was simple. Breaking away from Britain's brutal system isn't just politics. For any true American, it is simply common sense. From that moment on, the idea of American exceptionalism, that we are special, took deep root in the American psyche. Get this, the population was only 3 million back then, yet Common Sense sold 500,000 copies. In today's terms, that is absolutely viral. By early 1776, the tide was turning fast. Even the legends we now call the Founding Fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Patrick Henry, they were all captivated by Paine's words. As summer rolled in, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft the official statement. They actually voted for independence on July 2nd, but the truly historic moment, the one we all remember, happened 2 days later, on July 4th.
representatives from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to formally adopt the Declaration of Independence. This document was the final seal of approval, justifying the bold step they had taken just 48 hours prior. Now let's break down the two most critical parts of this document. First, the philosophy. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It states that governments exist solely to secure these rights, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. And if any government destroys these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Second, it lists the crimes of the king. It accuses him of violating the social contract and conspiring against the colonies behind Parliament's back. It concludes that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. It declares them absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, dissolving all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain. This is without a doubt the most important document in American history. It's why we celebrate Independence Day on the 4th of July. And from that moment on, we weren't just colonies anymore. We became states.
While Thomas Paine was busy firing up the colonies with common sense, the British High Command came to a realization. Boston was a tactical nightmare. Think about it. Boston was the hotbed of the rebellion. Anti-British sentiment was off the charts there. Plus, geographically, it was too easy to get trapped and surrounded. Defending it was a lost cause. So, on March 17, 1776, they pulled the plug. The British Army, along with hundreds of loyalists, packed up and evacuated to Halifax, Nova Scotia. But don't think for a second that they gave up. They just regrouped. By the summer of '76, a massive armada appeared off the coast of New York, hundreds of ships and 32,000 troops. New York was the perfect staging ground. Its deep harbor played right into the hands of the mighty Royal Navy. Plus, capturing it meant they could slice the colonies in half, separating the North from the South. And if that wasn't scary enough, they brought in the heavy hitters, the Hessians, about 8,000 terrifying German mercenaries sent over to crush the rebellion. These weren't just random soldiers. In European warfare, Hessians were elite killing machines, right up there with the Swiss Guard. They were the best money could buy. General William Howe was so confident with this massive force that he gave the Continental Congress an ultimatum: surrender now and get a royal pardon, or face total annihilation. The British were absolutely sure they had this in the bag. But wait, there's another layer to this mess. Just before this showdown, the Continental Congress made one of the biggest blunders of the entire war: the failed invasion of Quebec, Canada. Washington tried his best to turn his ragtag militia into a real army, but that disastrous northern campaign cost him dearly. He was left with only 19,000 men, and to be honest, about 4,000 of them were too sick or wounded to even hold a musket. It looked like a suicide mission on paper, yet they chose war and declared independence anyway. General Howe saw this as the perfect chance. He wanted to crush Washington's army right there and kill the spirit of the Declaration before it could even spread. So, Washington is cornered. How on earth is he going to survive this? He dug in on Long Island, specifically Brooklyn, right across from Manhattan. He positioned his troops with the East River at their backs. It was risky, but he was betting on a repeat of the Bunker Hill strategy: hold the high ground and bleed the British dry if they dared to attack. Long Island has a natural ridge running through its center like a spine. Washington used this as a shield. There were only 4 ways through this ridge: 3 passes and a coastal road. He split his forces to plug these gaps, keeping a reserve force in the back just in case. On paper, it was a solid plan, but in reality, a disaster waiting to happen.
The Continental Army had never coordinated a defense this complex before. Washington didn't know his officers well enough to predict who would crack under pressure. Basically, he was flying blind. And then, inevitably, someone dropped the ball. A massive blunder happened in the eastern sector at a place called Jamaica Pass. It was a crucial gateway into Brooklyn, yet they defended it with, get this, only 5 guards. The British played it perfectly. They pinned down the front lines with feints, then swung their main force right through that empty Jamaica Pass. The American flank collapsed instantly. But over on the west, General Sterling's men fought like lions, holding the line for over 2 hours to buy time. In the chaos, Washington scrambled to rally his troops at Brooklyn Heights for a last stand. But let's be honest, the defense was crumbling. So, was it a total victory for the British? Surprisingly, no. At the critical moment, General Howe hesitated. Under the cover of a thick fog, some call it a miracle, about 9,000 American troops slipped silently across the East River into Manhattan. Howe eventually followed, but he moved too slowly. By the time he got there, Washington was gone. Howe's problem was that he was too cautious. He was obsessed with minimizing his own casualties. Thanks to that hesitation, Washington, despite a crushing defeat, managed to escape capture and save his army from total annihilation. If Howe had just pushed harder, even if it cost him more men, he could have crushed the trapped Continental Army or captured Washington. That would have ended the war right there. It's ironic. At Bunker Hill, they took the ground but lost too many men. Here, he needed to sacrifice men to destroy the enemy, but he refused. He played it safe, like an accountant, not a general, choosing a victory that looked good on paper but failed to win the war. Despite the escape, the British succeeded in their main goal. They kicked the rebels out of Long Island and forced them to abandon Manhattan. They chased Washington's army all the way across the Jersey Plains, over the Delaware River and into Pennsylvania. The British settled into winter quarters at a Hessian outpost in Trenton, New Jersey. Now, if you know anything about winters there, you know it gets brutal. We're talking sub-zero wind chills. Back then, armies didn't fight in that weather. They hibernated. But Washington wasn't hibernating. Christmas night, 1766, he leads his ragged men back across the frozen Delaware, catches the Hessians completely off guard, and takes Trenton. This was the Battle of Trenton, the moment Washington's grit and genius truly shined. You have to understand how desperate things were. Before this, the Continental Army had been losing non-stop. Morale was non-existent. Washington had barely 5,000 men left in Pennsylvania, while General Howe had 12,000 troops nearby and another 20,000 waiting in New York. The army was on the verge of collapse. If the river froze solid, the British could just walk across and wipe them out. Worse, enlistments were set to expire on December 31st. In just a few days, Washington wouldn't have an army left to command. It was do or die. So Washington made a bold gamble. He realized they couldn't win a fair fight with muskets, so he decided, we'll beat them with firepower. He gathered nearly all his artillery for one massive all-in strike on Trenton. On Christmas night, he split his army into 3 columns to cross the river, but the weather was a nightmare, a nor'easter blizzard. 2 of the columns failed to make it across. Only Washington's group, about 2,400 men, managed to reach the other side. But maybe luck or destiny was on his side. They marched 9 miles in the snow, seized the high ground at Trenton, set up those cannons, and unleashed hell on the surprised Hessians. That victory changed everything. Soldiers re-enlisted for another 6 weeks. They defended their ground and then marched on to Princeton, kicking the British out of the college there. It was a miracle combination of guts, tactics, and pure luck. That moment, Washington standing in the boat amidst the ice was immortalized in a massive 21-foot painting. It hangs in the Met in New York today, the ultimate symbol of the American Revolution.
In part 1, we saw Washington pull off a Christmas miracle. But let's be real, the celebration didn't last long. He couldn't actually hold on to Trenton or Princeton. Instead, he had to retreat to the hills near Morristown just to survive the harsh winter. Then came 1777, the year that changed everything. We're talking about the single most critical turning point in the entire Revolutionary War, the Battle of Saratoga. By this point, the war was a grind. After more than 200 skirmishes, both sides were totally drained. The British decided they needed a knockout blow, one massive shock to end the war. Their plan? A classic pincer movement to crush the rebels from both sides. Here's the blueprint. General Howe would march up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany. At the same time, another British force would march down from Quebec. They'd meet in the middle, squeezing the Continental Army until it popped. Leading the northern force was Gentleman Johnny, Burgoyne. He was brimming with confidence, sure of an easy win. But things were about to go horribly wrong. You see, General Howe was supposed to move north to meet him. Instead, he went rogue. He marched south to attack Philadelphia. This left Burgoyne completely stranded in the northern wilderness, marching his men straight into a disaster without any backup. So why on earth did Howe ditch the plan? In his mind, capturing Philadelphia, the rebel capital, was the checkmate move. He thought if he took the city, the war would end right there. And that was the fatal flaw of the British Army. No unified command. Every general was fighting his own war, chasing his own glory, instead of working together as a team. General Burgoyne's army, marching from the north, paused to set up camp in Saratoga instead of pushing through to Massachusetts. That was his mistake. The rebels, who had been on the back foot, saw an opening and scrambled fast to flip the script. Washington ordered troops down from Montreal to Saratoga, but they didn't line up in an open field like gentlemen. Now, they used the dense forests to their advantage, turning the terrain into a weapon. While the British stood in formation, the Americans hid behind trees, unleashing chaos. This wasn't just spray and pray. They deployed elite sharpshooters, men who lived and breathed marksmanship. These guys could pick off a target from a distance that seemed impossible to the British, and they played dirty. They specifically targeted the officers to decapitate the British command structure. But the real game changer was the hardware. The British carried the standard Brown Bess musket. The Americans? They were packing the Kentucky long rifle. The difference was night and day. The British gun was built for speed. For some reason, the British Army was obsessed with rate of fire, a habit they stubbornly kept right up until World War I. But the American rifle, it had double the range. The Brown Bess tapped out at 100 yards, but the Kentucky rifle could hit a target at 200 yards. And in terms of accuracy, it wasn't even close. Why the difference? Survival. In the vast American wilderness, fighting Native Americans meant you needed to shoot from a distance before they got too close. Look, in a European open field line battle, winning speed wins. But in the American woods, it's a sniper's paradise. Being able to hit the enemy long before they can even see you, that's how you win here. The numbers speak for themselves. 300 American casualties versus over 1,000 British. In the end, Burgoyne had to swallow his aristocratic pride and surrender. It was the first time a British army had ever surrendered in history. The world was absolutely in shock. Here's the kicker. The Americans just scored their first massive victory at Saratoga, but Washington didn't get to celebrate. Why? Because General Howe practically walked into Philadelphia and took it without a fight. The Congress had to flee to York, Pennsylvania. In today's terms, Washington had just lost the capital city. Howe had been on a winning streak since Long Island, but he couldn't land that final knockout blow. He was getting confused. He thought, I took their capital. This should be over. Why aren't they quitting? What on earth do I have to capture to win this war? The Continental Army was baffling. They weren't growing, but every time Howe crushed them, they somehow bounced back. It must have felt like fighting a zombie army that just wouldn't stay dead. A long war was a nightmare for Britain. Shipping an army across the Atlantic cost a fortune, and if they needed reinforcements, it took months. If those ships were late, an entire army could be wiped out. That logistical nightmare is exactly why Howe was forced to play it safe over and over again. But Washington wasn't exactly happy either. He looked at his troops and saw a mess, a ragtag group with no discipline and low morale. He honestly didn't know if they could actually do anything. So, in the brutal winter of 1777, Washington gave up on Philadelphia and retreated west to a desolate spot called Valley Forge. He hunkered down there to build a winter camp with about 8,000 to 10,000 shivering men. In the middle of this misery, a colorful character shows up, a real eccentric. He claimed to be a Prussian baron and a former lieutenant general under Frederick the Great. His name? Friedrich William Augustus Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben. Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast. To put it in perspective, his name sounds like someone just mashed up every great general in history, like calling himself Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Napoleon, Rommel. Now, he was in the Prussian army, but he was actually just a captain, not a general. He essentially padded his resume to convince Congress he could fix their army. To most, he looked like a total fraud, but one man saw his true potential: George Washington. Steuben fixed the nuts and bolts that Washington couldn't. He wrote the drill manual from scratch. But here's the genius part. He didn't force the robot-like Prussian discipline on them. He knew he was dealing with free men, so he adapted the strict European drills to fit the American spirit. He famously said, "In Prussia you say, 'Do this,' and the soldier does it. But here I am obliged to say, 'This is the reason why you ought to do this,' and then he does it." Now, he didn't turn them into a force superior to the British overnight, but he gave them tactical discipline. He gave Washington options on the battlefield that he never had before. Even when they lost or retreated, they didn't fall apart anymore. The soldiers felt the difference. Confidence started to build, and slowly, Congress got its act together regarding supplies and the draft. An army isn't just about winning battles, it's about growth. You can be winning, but if your veterans are dying, your best officers are gone, and you're running out of ammo, the soldiers start to panic. But the Americans were the opposite. They were losing battles, yet they were leveling up. Better training, better officers, better supplies. A learning army like that doesn't lose hope. Step by step, they were becoming a real threat.
We've reached the halfway point of the revolution. The Continental Army is growing stronger, sure, but let's be honest, they still aren't ready to go toe-to-toe with the British Empire and win. On the other side, the British keep winning battles, but they are flailing strategically. They still can't locate the enemy's heart or head to deliver that final killing blow. The mission is clear for both sides. The Americans need to get stronger, fast. The British need to figure out how to end this war before the rebels become unstoppable. It is a race against time. This high-stakes tension sets the stage for round 3 of the war. And trust me, under this kind of pressure, both sides are going to make desperate mistakes and face brutal struggles. With the Continental Army's historic victory at Saratoga, the end of the Revolutionary War is finally coming into sight. But that victory didn't just boost morale, it delivered a totally unexpected gift to the Continental Army, a gift that would become the decisive blow securing America's complete independence. So what exactly was this gift that finally severed the iron grip Britain held over America? Let's unravel that mystery right now. The triumph at Saratoga provided the Continental Army with the extra firepower they desperately needed to win the war. And what was that decisive blow? It was the alliance. Because of this victory, France finally agreed to join the fight. The colonial leaders realized a hard truth. They couldn't win this war alone. They needed a heavy hitter in their corner. So who was the perfect candidate? France. Why France? Simple. They were dying to see Britain knock down a peg. They knew that if Britain lost a huge chunk of its empire, France stood to gain the most power in Europe. But did France jump in to help right away? Not exactly. At first, they slipped us some supplies under the table, but they were hesitant to officially recognize the United States as a real country. That's when Benjamin Franklin stepped in. He crossed the Atlantic to personally charm the French into giving us official support. But it wasn't easy. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, laid down the law. He basically said, "Show me proof that you can actually win this war." And that's where Franklin played his ace. He presented the victory at Saratoga as undeniable proof that the Americans were the real deal. When news of Saratoga hit London in December 1777, it sent shockwaves through the government. British Prime Minister Lord North scrambled to offer a desperate peace deal. He basically told the colonies, "Look, if you stop fighting, we'll give you total self-rule within the empire." This terrified the French foreign minister, Vergennes. He was afraid the Americans might actually take the bait. If they did, France would lose its golden opportunity to crush Britain once and for all. So he didn't wait. On February 6, 1778, France officially recognized the United States as a sovereign nation and declared war on Britain. The floodgates opened, and they promised massive military aid, money, and weapons. And the cost? It was astronomical. France poured about 1.3 billion livres into this war. In today's money, we're talking over $5.5 billion. But here's the tragic irony. This massive spending completely bankrupted France. Not only that, French soldiers returned home infected with the American spirit of liberty and freedom, which helped spark the French Revolution. In the end, the very alliance that saved America led to the downfall of the French monarchy, eventually costing King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette their heads. With France entering the fray, this wasn't just a colonial rebellion anymore. It exploded into a full-blown global conflict. Britain's old rivals, Spain and the Netherlands, saw blood in the water and jumped in to support the Americans with money and supplies. France didn't just send checks, though. They provided the one thing America desperately lacked: a navy and an expeditionary force. This was crucial for the endgame. So what was the knockout punch? It was the combination of a hardened Continental Army and the sheer military muscle of France. In the beginning, Britain tried to play it smart. Instead of total war, they tried to win over the loyalists, colonists who still bowed to the king. They wanted to win hearts and minds. But that strategy backfired. As the fighting spread to isolated communities, more civilians got caught in the crossfire. Instead of loyalty, the British accidentally fueled the fire for independence. Meanwhile, up north, the war hit a stalemate. In May 1778, Sir Henry Clinton took command and pulled British troops back from Philadelphia to New York. While the British sat tight in New York, the Americans made a move. George Rogers Clark led a daring expedition over the Appalachian Mountains, seizing key settlements in the Illinois Territory from the British and their native allies. The British were masters of conventional warfare, lining up and shooting, but they were getting absolutely exhausted by the Continental Army's hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. Realizing they were stuck, Britain decided to roll the dice on one final gamble. They needed a new strategy, so they turned their eyes to the south. The plan was clear: secure the south, rally the loyalist militias, and then march on Virginia. They figured if they could crush Virginia, the heart of the rebellion, they could finally turn the tide of the war. They also set their sights on a port town called Yorktown. The goal was to turn it into a naval base where the British fleet could come and go as they pleased. Enter Lord Cornwallis, the British commander in the south. He wasted no time. On August 16, 1780, at the Battle of Camden, he absolutely crushed the Continental Army. It was a disaster for the Americans. Desperate to save the South, Congress played their best card. They sent Nathaniel Greene, arguably their most brilliant strategist next to Washington. But here's the thing, even before Greene arrived, the momentum was already shifting. October 10, 1780, Kings Mountain. A group of American frontier riflemen stormed out of the woods and completely wiped out over 1,000 of Cornwallis's reinforcements. It was a stunning ambush. When Greene took command, he refused to play by British rules. He avoided direct open battles. Instead, he split his army into mobile units to bait, harass, and frustrate Cornwallis. This wasn't just good strategy. It proved the Continental Army had evolved enough to pull off complex maneuvers. Eventually, Greene gathered his full strength for a ferocious showdown at Guilford Courthouse. The British technically won the field, but the cost was devastating. They lost so many men that they had to abandon the campaign in the Carolinas entirely. Instead, Cornwallis moved north to raid Virginia, but needing to protect his dwindling forces, he made a fateful decision: to dig in and wait for supplies at Yorktown. And that was the mistake. It left the main British forces dangerously split between Yorktown and New York. The trap was set. With the British dug into Yorktown, the war hung in the balance. The French allies saw a golden opportunity and insisted on striking Yorktown immediately before the British could fortify further. George Washington pulled off a masterstroke of deception. He secretly moved the entire combined army south to Yorktown with lightning speed, catching everyone off guard. Meanwhile, Admiral de Grasse sailed his massive French fleet into the Chesapeake Bay, effectively blocking off the York River. The trap was snapped shut. The French Navy cut off any escape by sea, while Allied ground forces surrounded the town. The numbers were overwhelming. 15,000 Allied troops against a British force half that size. Cornwallis hunkered down, praying that Sir Henry Clinton would rush down from New York with reinforcements. But that help was never coming. Clinton was paralyzed in New York, fearing that leaving his base would leave him vulnerable to attack. Cornwallis was on his own. The British dug in behind their defensive redoubts. The Franco-American forces responded with classic siege tactics, digging parallel trenches that inched closer and closer to the British lines. Back then, charging a fortified position head-on was a suicide mission. The solution was to dig zigzagging trenches. This allowed the troops to safely advance toward the walls without exposing themselves to direct fire down a straight line. The British rained down cannon fire to stop the digging, but the Allies were relentless. The noose was tightening, and there was nothing Cornwallis could do to stop it. As the trenches inched closer, the Allied firepower became overwhelming. The French artillery, the precursors to Napoleon's legendary corps and arguably the best in the world at the time, were surgical with their aim. They systematically silenced the British guns. Cornwallis was checkmated. Yorktown turned into a living hell. As the noose tightened, shells rained down on the town non-stop. Crammed into damp underground bunkers with civilians, the British troops became a breeding ground for disease. Sickness spread like wildfire, taking hundreds of soldiers out of the fight. The Allied stranglehold was complete. Cut off from all supplies, the British were starving. Their only hope was the Royal Navy, but even they were paralyzed by the sheer dominance of the French fleet. Think about that. The Royal Navy had ruled the waves for 2 centuries, but right here, at this moment, they suffered a rare and total humiliation. It was as if history decided they had to take a fall just so America could rise. Desperate and out of options, Cornwallis tried a risky nighttime escape across the river, but a storm ruined even that plan. Finally, in October 1781, he bowed to the inevitable. He surrendered his entire army of over 7,000 men. Britain's final gamble to crush the revolution had failed. The war was effectively over.
So here's the million-dollar question. How on earth did the most powerful military machine in the world lose to a ragtag army of colonists? From a tactical standpoint, the British commanders were fundamentally lost. They simply didn't know how to fight this kind of war. Usually, to crush a rebellion, you have a standard playbook. Capture the capital, seize the economic hubs, or wipe out the rebel army. You either break their will or prop up the local loyalists to take over. But here's the kicker. None of that worked here. Why? Because the 13 colonies didn't have a capital. Not really. New York was just a big trading hub. Philadelphia was just a meeting hall. In short, there was no London in America to burn down and claim victory. Chasing these phantom capitals just split the British forces apart. Clinton was in New York, Howe was in Philly, they were scattered. And General Burgoyne, he marched all the way from Canada only to vanish into defeat. The tyranny of distance was real. With the Atlantic Ocean between them and home, the British were terrified of pushing too deep inland. If they chased the Americans too far, they outran their supply lines. And the logistics were a nightmare. Guerrillas constantly ambushed their supply trains, and the British couldn't stop them. They were effectively paralyzed, unable to penetrate the interior. This lack of strategic targets gave the Americans a massive advantage: mobility. This created 2 huge problems for the British. First, they could never force a fight on their terms. In war, the side that chooses the battlefield wins. But whenever the British set up a fight, the Americans would just slip away. Then the Americans would pop up somewhere else and say, "Hey, we're over here," forcing the British to come to them. The Americans dictated the map. Even when the British won, like at Bunker Hill, they bled too much. Fighting on American-chosen ground meant heavy casualties. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, leading them straight into isolation and ruin. Second problem, the so-called loyalists weren't that loyal. The British were operating in deep, hostile territory. It was an intelligence black hole. They couldn't even send out scouts without them getting attacked. Small scouting parties got beaten up by villagers. The land was too vast to map properly. Worse, the locals fed them fatal lies about river depths and terrain. This disinformation led the British into trap after trap. In the end, Britain simply lost the will to fight. Realizing the war was unwinnable, they sued for peace. And so, after 8 long years of blood and strategy, the American Revolutionary War finally came to an end.